On February 4th, 1859, the United States signed a treaty of friendship, commerce, and navigation with Paraguay. All foreign policy is important in its own way, but this particular treaty might not have been all that notable. In roughly the same era, Paraguay signed almost identically worded treaties with France, Great Britain, and the Kingdom of Sardinia. But the path to friendship between the United States and Paraguay was a rather rocky one that included an, up to that point, unprecedented deployment of the United States Navy. The Paraguay expedition of 1858 was predicated on dubious grounds and was an example of gunboat diplomacy with wholly inadequate gunboats. If for no other reason than as a cautionary tale, however, it deserves to be remembered.
In his first annual address to Congress on December 8, 1857, President James Buchanan expressed concerns about a South American state then virtually unknown to the American public. He said, "I regret to inform you that the President of Paraguay has refused to ratify the treaty between the United States and that state, as amended by the Senate," the signature of which was mentioned in the message of my predecessor to Congress at the opening of its session in December 1853. The refusal would seem to have been strange, as the treaty had been previously agreed upon. But even worse, Buchanan noted that whilst in the peaceful prosecution of her voyage up the Parana River, the U.S. Navy steamer Water Witch was fired upon by a Paraguayan fort. A sailor had been killed. The president was indignant. He said, "I am constrained to consider the attack upon her as unjustifiable and as calling for satisfaction from the Paraguayan government." Perhaps worse, as Buchanan sought to expand U.S. trade in the Americas, citizens of the United States, also who were established in business in Paraguay, have had their property seized and taken from them, and had otherwise been treated by the authorities in an insulting and arbitrary manner which requires redress. This was a surprising state of affairs, and Buchanan, interested in expanding U.S. influence in the Americas, made a request of Congress. "A demand for these purposes will be made in a firm but conciliatory spirit. This will the more probably be granted if the executive shall have authority to use other means in the event of a refusal. This is accordingly recommended." That is, the president was asking Congress to give permission for him, in a firm but conciliatory spirit, to send the United States Navy to the landlocked South American nation of Paraguay. In his memoir, published in 1865, he noted the response. On the 2nd of June, 1858, they passed a joint resolution authorizing the president to adopt such measures and use such force as in his judgment may be necessary and advisable in the event of a refusal of just satisfaction by the government of Paraguay. Apparently, in the president's judgment, quite a lot of force would be necessary and advisable. A fleet under the command of Admiral William Branford Shubrick would include some 19 vessels, at a time when the entire Navy consisted of only some 90 vessels. It was the largest naval expedition ever to leave the United States up to that time, almost a quarter of the strength of the Navy. That seems something of overkill, given that, as historian Thomas Oren Flickman wrote in his 1965 doctoral dissertation for Wayne State University, the United States faced no issue of vital national interest in its relations with Paraguay. So what had happened to lead these two nations to the brink of war? Flickman writes, "It would appear that the relations between these two nations should have proceeded with a minimum of friction. However, friction did arise." Buchanan summarized the friction in his autobiography. That government had, upon frivolous and even insulting pretexts, refused to ratify the Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation concluded with it on the 4th of March, 1853, as amended by the Senate, though this in only mere matters of form. It had seized and appropriated the property of American citizens residing in Paraguay in a violent and arbitrary manner. And finally, by order of President Lopez, it had fired upon the United States steamer Water Witch under Commander Thomas J. Page of the Navy and killed the sailor at the helm, while she was peacefully employed in surveying the Parana River to ascertain its fitness for steam navigation. Paraguay was a relatively small landlocked country in the central region of South America, bordered by Brazil, Argentina, and Bolivia. A former Spanish colony, the nation had won its independence in 1811. After independence, the nation had been ruled under a series of military juntas, its leaders holding dictatorial power. Unlike many other South American states, Paraguay had sought a path of self-sufficiency and was generally mistrustful of foreign nations. The small nation lived under constant threats and border disputes with their much larger neighbors, Brazil and Argentina. That there would be friction with the United States might not be surprising. Since 1841, Paraguay had been under the control of President Carlos Antonio Lopez, Lopez held essentially dictatorial power, and while he did work to modernize the country, a 1990 history published by the Research Division of the Library of Congress said of the Paraguayan president, known as El Excelentismo, or the most excellent one, Lopez was a despot who wanted to found a dynasty and run Paraguay like a personal fiefdom. That is not to say that he wasn't successful. The report notes that Paraguay prospered under El Excelentismo. The nation made strides in development and education, but the report notes Lopez lacked diplomatic adroitness. Irascible and mistrustful, George Thompson, a British engineer who served in the military under Lopez, noted in his 1869 description of the country, Lopez I got into hot water with all the powers he had anything to do with. He has a petulant temper and disliked foreigners generally, though he treated them well, probably from having a notion that their governments were stronger than he. But the tensions cannot be laid, or at least not wholly laid, on El Excelentismo's bad temper. U.S. diplomacy of the era was largely ineffectual. A 1961 history of the State Department written by William Barnes and John Heath Morgan explains that the deficiency of the service were apparent at an early date. Attached loosely to the Department of State, whose supervision of them was far from adequate, and lacking any organizational framework of their own derived from law, they can scarcely be said to have an independent corporate existence apart from the individuals who happen to hold appointments at a given time. This arrangement was particularly dangerous because diplomatic positions were apportioned via the political spoils system, based on politics with little regard for experience or competence. In fact, they generally operated from personal motive. Diplomat Wilbur Carr explained in a 1907 edition of the American Journal of International Law that no salaries were provided for these officials. The Americans available for appointment were, as a rule, engaged in mercantile or other pursuits. A large majority of the persons appointed desired the office of consul for their own personal benefit. In Paraguay, that person was Edward A. Hopkins. Historian Harold F. Peterson wrote of Hopkins in a 1942 edition of the Hispanic American Historical Review. Throughout a decade in the middle of the last century, Hopkins was a stormy petrel in the politics of the Plata region. Historian Pablo Max Insfran explains in a 1954 edition of the Hispanic American Historical Review that Hopkins had served in the U.S. Navy in Brazilian and Rio de la Plata waters, but his unruly, quarrelsome, pugnacious, and arrogant temperament led him into endless brawls, ashore and aboard ship, which led to his court-martial and resignation from the Navy. In an initial appointment as America's special agent to Paraguay in 1845, when Buchanan was Secretary of State, Hopkins had displayed that temperament and managed to offend both Lopez and Juan Manuel de Rosas, dictator of Argentina. Despite his missteps, Hopkins again gained appointment in Paraguay, apparently because he was the only person who applied. There he worked for his own personal benefit. Peterson writes that he had promoted an American corporation for the exploitation of the reputed riches of the Paraguayan treasure house. The company was called the New England Company, which sought to make money operating a steamer and package service on Paraguay's rivers. But Insfran writes, Hopkins' incorrigible truculence became more pronounced in the face of adversity. He assumed without reason an aloof attitude of contemptuousness towards the people of the country. Hopkins managed to raise hackles even on minor diplomatic points. Hopkins eventually became estranged from Lopez. Insfran opines that, through his arrogance, Hopkins had conjured up his own nemesis, who was eventually forced to leave the country, and the New England Company collapsed. Insfran notes the United States and Paraguay Navigation Company lost no time in appealing to the President of the United States and the Secretary of State for protection and indemnity in its claim against the violent wrongs and wanton outrages allegedly inflicted by President Lopez upon the company. This was one of Buchanan's complaints, stated in 1857. Shortly after Hopkins left, an issue arose with the Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation that had been negotiated in 1853. As another sign of the poor state of American diplomacy, the treaty, which had been negotiated by a diplomat stationed in Brazil, despite being nearly a word-for-word copy of treaties between Paraguay and other nations, was filled with errors. Jean Allen Smith and Larry Bartlett explained in a 2009 publication of the Canadian Nautical Research Society. Lopez had signed a treaty with the United States in March 1853, and it had been sent to the Senate for ratification. Similar to those between Paraguay and Great Britain, France, and Sardinia, the treaty contained numerous technical errors. Most involved the substitution of the titles the North American Union and the United States of North America for the United States of America. The Senate made the necessary corrections and ratified the treaty. But the revised Treaty of Friendship arrived at a bad time. Hopkins had just been thrown out, and Lopez was furious. With no U.S. diplomat available, the treaty was presented by the captain of a U.S. Navy vessel, the gunboat USS Water Witch. The boat had already irritated Lopez when he believed it had violated orders regarding Paraguayan territory, and then in the diplomatic row over Hopkins, had at one point trained its guns on Lopez's presidential palace. Lieutenant Thomas Jefferson Page, in command of the Water Witch, was no diplomat and a poor choice to bring the treaty to Lopez. The angry Lopez, Smith and Bartlett explained, refused to accept the treaty because it did not include a Spanish translation, thus the second of Buchanan's complaints. Finally, on February 1st, 1855, there was an incident with the Water Witch. As a result of Page and Hopkins' actions, angry Lopez had closed Paraguayan waters to foreign warships. 4 months later, in violation of the Lopez decree, Page ordered Lieutenant William Jeffers, a relative newcomer to South America, to proceed up the Parana River with Water Witch to collect scientific data. Possibly because of an inaccurate map, Jeffers took Water Witch on the Paraguayan side of an island in the river. The opposite side, bordering Argentina, was free for navigation, but the Paraguayan side was subject to Lopez's order. After several warning shots and an attempt to talk to Jeffers refusing the note from a Paraguayan commander as it was written in Spanish, as Smith and Bartlett note, undoubtedly retaliating for Lopez's similar refusal to accept the Treaty of Ratification in October 1854, the fortress on the Paraguayan side finally fired on Water Witch. The boat was damaged, and the helmsman, named Samuel Chaney, was mortally wounded. The Water Witch was only lightly armed, although Jeffers had apparently anticipated trouble and had his guns cleared for action, fired a desultory and apparently ineffective shot, and retreated. Thus the third of Buchanan's complaints. The reasoning is obviously suspect. All three of the complaints leveled by the president in his address are clearly as much a result of the actions of Hopkins and the officers aboard Water Witch as they were the fault of Lopez. Buchanan's outrage was quizzical. Buchanan writes, "It is difficult to believe that the United States' response to a few trivial diplomatic incidents could have been so drastic, especially since Paraguay was an almost unknown nation to the United States and of slight weight in her diplomatic and commercial calculations. If newspaper reaction is any indication, there was no public pressure for action against Paraguay. The press coverage of these events was not only sparse, but even condemnatory of the conduct of Hopkins and Page. So why did the situation require a quarter of the United States fleet? It might be that Buchanan, looking for a success, was trying to duplicate the success of Commodore Matthew Perry's expeditions in 1852 and 1854 that had opened up contact with Japan, whose policy of diplomatic isolation was superficially similar to Paraguay. Smith and Bartlett suggest that Buchanan, whose policy was becoming increasingly unpopular at home, was simply looking to distract from domestic complaints. Another suggestion is that the fleet was sent as a show of force for all of South America to see. As Harper's Weekly opined, it's not likely that the expedition will confine its labors to Paraguay. While it is on the coast of South America, it will probably settle all of our outstanding accounts with the nations of that part of the world. Flickama notes that diplomat Charles A. Washburn, who served as the United States minister to Paraguay during the 1860s, suggested that the expedition was actually a plot by southern states, to whom Buchanan had obvious sympathies. Flickama writes, he contends that the raising of a force to send against Paraguay was a southern conspiracy designed to withdraw from the northern forts arms and munitions, thus leaving them improvided with arms whenever the plans for the Great Rebellion should be matured. In any case, the fleet began assembling off Montevideo, Uruguay in December 1858. Diplomat James B. Bolin accompanied the fleet and was instructed to present a specific set of demands. If Lopez would not agree, he was to hand over the issue to Admiral Shubrick, who was supposed to blockade the river and capture the Paraguayan capital of Concepcion if possible. The result was somewhat anticlimactic. Bolin and Shubrick took the steamer USS Fulton to Concepcion, where they were able to negotiate an agreement under a rather loose interpretation of Buchanan's terms, and on February 4th the Treaty of Amity was duly signed. Lopez was allowed to stop short of apology. A much smaller than expected indemnity was paid to the family of Seaman Chaney, and the issue of indemnification for the New England Company was given over for international arbitration. Why the settlement? Flickama suggests that Bolin and Shubrick had, over the course of the expedition, come to mistrust Hopkins and the New England Company's claims. In essence, they saw through the flimsy reasoning for the expedition. They came in a conciliatory spirit that impressed Lopez. Meanwhile, neither side wanted war. It was by then obvious that the U.S. was moving towards its own civil war, while Lopez was concerned about potential conflict with Brazil. The extent to which Bolin and Shubrick went in the negotiation was shown in a single point. Shubrick suggested the attorney, James Mandeville Carlyle, that would represent Paraguay in the international arbitration. But there was another underlying factor. Despite Harper's Weekly describing the fleet as the finest we have ever seen abroad in time of peace, Shubrick understood that it was not up to the task assigned. The larger ships had too deep a draft to traverse the river to Concepcion. The river steamers were private vessels that had been purchased and outfitted, but were nearly universally determined to be unfit as warships. Mark Coriston of Emporia State University noted that the fleet had a critical shortage of munitions for both its cannon and small arms. He opined, in the event of military action had become necessary, it is unlikely that the naval force could have accomplished its mission with much success. Lopez may not have been aware, it's not clear how much Shubrick was bluffing, but the admiral certainly realized that his gunboat diplomacy was, frankly, backed by inadequate gunboats. In his autobiography, Buchanan presented the expedition as a great success, claiming that the appearance of so large a force, fitted out in such a prompt manner in the far distant water of the La Plata, and the admirable conduct of the officers and men employed in it, have had a happy effect in favor of our country throughout all that remote portion of the world.
The Paraguayan expedition is a relatively obscure bit of early U.S. adventurism in the Americas. It is sometimes misrepresented historically as being much more of a success than it really was, partially because of Buchanan's efforts to rehabilitate his image. James Buchanan is considered by many historians to be among the worst of the U.S. presidents. When the question of indemnity to the New England Company came to international arbitration, which had a representative from Paraguay and from the United States, they both got together and decided that Lopez was not at all responsible for the collapse of the company and that no indemnity was owed. All that Paraguay ended up paying in the entire event was the $10,000 to the family of the dead sailor Cheney, whereas the cost to the United States Navy of the expedition was estimated to exceed $3 million. The diplomatic row did lead some impetus to the slow process of reforming the U.S. Foreign Service, and the U.S. Navy did learn important lessons about logistics and the need for shallow draft vessels that could operate on rivers, and both of those were valuable lessons in the upcoming Civil War. Some historians argue, however, that the row with the United States gave more impetus to Lopez's efforts to build up the Paraguayan military, which some people hold partially responsible for the coming War of the Triple Alliance, which started in 1864 and which would eventually devastate Paraguay. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.